Okay, we're in. All right. Hello. My name is Claude Myron Goozer, and I'm going to be moderating this panel on the history of inquiry and sort of ideas of narrative and truth as they apply to the sciences. I'm joined by Chad Davies and Zachary Davis. That's confusing, but we've got it. And I guess what this is really sort of about is navigating this postmodern idea that we're all sort of living in, that truth is constructed, uh, navigating that and certain kinds of ideas of hard limits to what physics entails. We've been discussing this for a little bit, and I've got a little bit of an introduction that I want to start with to sort of lay everything on the table. All right, so in his long poem, The Second Hour of the Night, which retells the tragic myth of Mira's incestuous love for her father, King Cinyras, Frank Bidart lays out a dictum that serves both as a description of poetic history and a statement detailing the shifting nature of historical truth. We inherit past forms, and in inheriting them, change them and are changed. So form is an inevitable part of poetic history, and whatever stance a poet takes to form is a response to that history. History is never static. It always and inevitably requires rethinking, as the moment produced from the historical past is both indebted to the past and different from it. But the past is a parameter that's unavoidable, a hard limit that you can't transgress. In the poet's terms, a radical given. That's his term for that, a radical given. Bidart's view is tragic, not figuratively, but literally. In classical tragedy, catastrophe occurs when characters attempt to master the radically given, to control fate and force it to their own desires. So history in this sense is fate, but again, it's not static. If tragedy is one model for Bidart's work, chaos is another, not in the sense of an absolute willy-nilliness or meaningless universe, but in the sense of chaos theory. From far away, a meteorologist can see the broad pattern, but events within the broad pattern can radically shift the pattern, and the afternoon picnic gets literally blown away. From far away, the fractal has clear lines and a set beginning and end, but the closer you get to the edges, the more they spread out in indeterminate directions, seemingly aimlessly, never ending. Bidart's poetry is a reaction to the postmodern poetics of his immediate forebears, a poetic that emphasizes radical, perpetual reinvention, and that relishes the multiplicity of approaches to a fluid truth. It rejects absolutes of fluidity, but recognizes that truth is not monolithic or necessarily coherent as a whole. Did y'all follow that? This is heady stuff. And it's really sort of abstract and far out. But it all came to mind a month or so ago when Chad, Zach, and I sort of sat down to try to figure out how all of our fields think through history, truth, and the fluctuations in narratives about truth. In short, each of our fields has to deal with the issues raised in postmodern thinking that truth is not an absolute, but in some sense constructed. Even the sciences, as Chad will describe, rely on multiple narratives to determine what can be considered the truth about representations of the world. And as Zach will explain, individual disciplines can become fiefdoms of truth, and knowledge can exist somewhat independently. But that doesn't mean that we live in a world where all truth and all things are absolutely relative. Okay, yeah, this is heady stuff. But Chad has a really compelling story to tell about different versions of scientific truths that emerged through narrative. And I think we might do well to sort of ground this discussion with that. So, Chad, if you want to take it away and sort of tell us some of those stories that help develop scientific understanding of truth.
So I'm going to pick a story that's fairly modern. And it's a little personal background. I grew up as a Cold War kid. I went to school in the 80s. I remember doing duck and cover drills, the Reagan administration, that whole thing. And as I was a geek from a long time ago, and so one of the things, of course, you learn a little bit about in just sort of typical geek training is you sort of learn the story of the atom, and how we arrive at an atomic theory. And of course, in a Cold War world, where atomic annihilation is something that's sort of always in the back of the mind, the atom becomes a pretty big or a pretty important thing to be a part of the worldview that you have. And so, the story that we were all told was really interesting because it's sort of what I call an Anglo-American story. And so the story I remember sort of hearing and learning and internalizing was the story that starts with Democritus and atoms being particles that move in a void. And then, you jump some 2,000 years or more forward and you arrive at John Dalton. And John Dalton's sort of reformulation of that based on empirical evidence that had been gathered to come up with atoms as billiard balls, as hard, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all kinds of spheres, and that becomes the thing. And then you jump another 100 years forward to J.J. Thomson at the Cavendish Laboratory and the discovery of the electron, and now atoms are not indivisible anymore. And you just leave behind that Greek idea of the indivisible particle. And then from there, you go to Rutherford, Ernest Rutherford, and you might talk a little bit about Niels Bohr, who was, he did his postdoc work with Rutherford, and certainly built on his work. And then you get Rutherford and Geiger and Marsden, who discover the nucleus. And then you just sort of jump again to the splitting of that nucleus. And there is this very linear great man, one person to the next person to the next person that seems to always run through England, and eventually land here in the United States. And that was sort of a narrative I accepted for a very long time until I started having to teach. And, being a guy who was interested in history and realizing that grounding some of what we were doing in a historical narrative might be helpful for my students, I started doing some research. And one of the questions that came up very quickly to me was, wait a minute, why does Rutherford do what's called the gold foil experiment, where he fires alpha particles at this gold foil? And, what's he doing with that? Why does he ever do that experiment? What's the scientific impetus for that? And start doing some research on why he wants to do that. And the thing you're always sort of told is he's going to test J.J. Thomson's what's sometimes called a plum pudding model. That's a very simplistic description of Thomson's thing. And what I began to realize is that, Rutherford's experiment, there's no reason you do that experiment, at least I couldn't imagine, if what you're doing is just looking at Thomson's model. And so in my research, what I found out was there was a figure that no one ever talked about. And that's Hantaro Nagaoka. And he is a Japanese physicist who originally starts doing his work in geophysics. And then after some training at some of the major research institutions in the late 1800s in Europe, goes back and goes to the University of Tokyo, takes a position there, and comes up with, after reading Thomson's papers about the discovery of the electron, comes up with what's probably, we're not entirely certain about the dating, but from what I've been able to find, is actually the first, what we might think of as modern model of the atom. And nobody had ever told me that this Japanese guy who had grown up in Nagasaki all of a sudden is perhaps the first guy to come up with a model called the Saturnian model. And his model has the atom is actually, you have this very large, positively charged center part. I don't think he uses the term nucleus, but it's something akin to that was then orbited very similarly to James Clerk Maxwell's model of the rings of Saturn, orbited by these electrons that have some structure in rings around that big central positively charged atom. A year later, from a lecture that he seems to have given on that, is when Rutherford publishes his plum pudding model, which has electrons inside of a positively charged sort of distributed thing, that those electrons have a ring structure as well. And what's interesting is when Rutherford publishes his paper in 1911, where he announces the discovery of a very small neutron, he talks very clearly in that paper about, Nagaoka's model and Nagaoka's work, and the fact that that work is informing his decision to do the experiment. In other words, the experiment doesn't just happen because Rutherford wants to sort of test, Thomson's model. What he's got is he's got two competing models, and he wants to see if he can gather data that will help narrow that down. And it's really, really fascinating because, in the sort of the given narrative for me as a Cold War kid, the Japanese contributor is completely eliminated from the story. And you get these great men when what you really find out when you dig down into that narrative is that it's a lot more complex. There's a lot more interaction, and that the contributors come from a lot more places than, this post-Cold War, this during the Cold War narrative seems to want to admit. And so there's a case in which the scientific work is absolutely grounded in, the empirical data that's collected by individuals. The story that gets told about that scientific work, however, is very much a thing that is constructed out of a post-World War II framework.
Unmute my mic. So the understanding of the history of the sciences has a lot to do with, or I guess a more accurate understanding of the history of the sciences has a lot to do with understanding a plurality of contributions, as opposed to this kind of like one individual genius sort of takes the road and gives us the sort of eternal truth about empirical reality.
Right. And then that gets picked up by the next great genius figure who you're probably not going to be or ever going to be. And so you just watch these great men for whom you don't, you will never approach their greatness, do the things in the world that make the modern world in which you live.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I thought was really sort of fascinating about our conversation was the way that you were emphasizing that science ultimately is collaborative, right?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
I also sort of grew up with that great man theory of science or great man theory of history. That's absolutely changed in I guess in my field, but is that still operative in your field, this sort of like individual genius idea, or are the sciences sort of more accepting of these kind of like messier narratives?
I think that's one of the things. While postmodernism in some ways gets a bad name in science for a couple of different reasons, this is probably the place where I think postmodernism has made the greatest contribution in our sort of broader cultural understanding of science, in that it allows for a much messier but also a much more human narrative, a much more the idea that the narrative's constructed, that while there are certainly touch points or grounded foundational empirical truths that are arrived at through observation, the way in which we recognize the community nature, starting with Thomas Kuhn's work on history of science and philosophy of science, and then going forward from there, has just really been a profound shift from what you saw coming out of, say anything from the 1940s through the early 1970s. Now I think there's even a great deal of movement, and something I'm interested in, what you would call nowadays the fancy terms called citizen science. But if you go back and you sort of recognize that oftentimes citizen science has a long history, but there's not a place for it in that great man, especially great white European man theory of history, where in fact you sort of sit down and recognize that maybe a lot of the medical work that becomes important later on grows up out of practical medicine that's done by just, midwives and, apothecaries and that sort of thing throughout, a culture.
Yeah, and I prepared a few things about helping us understand postmodernism from my background, which is more intellectual history and philosophy. So the one thing that's helpful to know for anyone who is engaging with the term postmodernism is that it's almost impossible to define, because the key postmodern move itself is to resist systematic classification. So there's almost nobody who will say, I am a postmodernist. It's usually a pejorative assigned by its enemies. You can think of Jordan Peterson here, saying everybody who he doesn't like is a postmodernist. The other challenge is that postmodernism has different meanings in different fields. So it means one thing in art and architecture, another in political theory, and another in literature and philosophy. And a philosopher, Gary Aylesworth, actually said it's better to think of postmodernism not as a set of doctrines, but as a sensibility of using modern strategies of critique against the institutionalization of modernity itself. That comes from Jean-Francois Lyotard, who wrote this really important book about all this called The Postmodern Condition. And he's the one who also, Chad, confirms that the Enlightenment dream that you would just go out there and discover truth is not actually how it has worked out. Rather, different fields structure their inquiry in different ways, and that ends up leading to different kinds of understandings, which may have some overlap, but it's not perfect coherence.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so, one way to think about truth is it's not a set of facts that we discover, but it's a set of stories that we tell and that can be persuasive or not.
So, all right. This gets us into, I guess, the stickier part of this, and this diverges, I guess, a little bit of what we talked about before. So, if you don't mind me throwing a hand grenade into the into the field here, this gets to the sort of difficulty, right? Like, what happens when you have competing models of truth, competing models even of reality? I live in Manhattan. I can't not think about this in very real political medical terms. I walk out of my apartment and it's like walking into Chernobyl. I dress myself up. I've got my mask. I've got hand sanitizer at the ready. I've got plastic bags in my hands. The wrong step can kill me. That is my empirical understanding of germ theory and my understanding of how the world functions, to try to gain as much medical knowledge as I possibly can about what to touch and what not to touch in order to keep myself and my family safe. How do you square that with an epistemology that radically rejects my understanding of how disease is conveyed?
Well, I might say, the paradigm for the rubber meets the road with postmodern or post-truth problems. So what I argue is cynical, downright evil political actors use the rhetoric of postmodernity to deny truth that is uncomfortable. Newt Gingrich actually was a master at this. He had this famous interview where the journalist was asking him all about how, he's saying that crime is terrible in all these cities. That's why, we need to get rid of these politicians because crime is so terrible. And the journalist is like, no, but all the crime stats are showing that it's going down. And he's like, no, that's not true. It's like, no, the FBI stats show that it's going down. And he's like, well, that's not what people feel. And so like moving from kind of facts to feeling is part of that move. And it has been weaponized by, really unsavory actors, and climate denial is like a perfect example of this. Truth is denied and you can say that it's, truth is subjective. So I do think there's a story about how truth and objective facts are denied. But I would say even with this case of COVID, I'd say there's been definitely some idiots who straight up deny some of what we know about the medical issues, but I don't actually think that's where the heat of the disagreement is. It actually is about values rather than facts. And I think sometimes it's easy to say that facts support my values, but actually it's more complicated. And so, you are having people have, reasonably good faith debates about the effect of unemployment, depression, and suicide versus, COVID case deaths. And like, I think one of the things anyone interested in a better public sphere is to try to talk about values more, and rather than hide behind like a cudgel of facts.
And Zach, that's just such a great way to put that. I mean, book I read here a couple of years back that has really informed a lot of my thinking is David Wooten's The Invention of Science. And it's sort of his discussion of, what he thinks of happens during this period we might call the scientific revolution. And he has a somewhat different take than the typical idea of what the scientific revolution was and all of that. And one of the things that he really talks about, the idea of this sense of what has authority, right? What in our society has authority. And then he talks a lot about in the period of that transition of what we call the scientific revolution and the birth of modernity, this legal idea of the fact, right? The factum, the thing that happened, that becomes something that initially has equal weight to, what might be thought of as ecclesial or political authority or tradition. And then over time, we'll begin to eclipse both of those things in terms of its sense of authority and argument, and in terms of its sense of value and validity in culture. And so
like the discovery of evolution,
or I mean, going further back than that, even is you should go back to Newton's Principia. Right. It's the mathematical principles of natural philosophy is the full name of that work. That's really a shot across. In fact, it's, sort of the final shot into the waterline of the ship that is Aristotelian natural philosophy. Prior to Newton's work, natural philosophers said, hey, we're going to tell you what the world is like based on philosophical musings rooted in Aristotelian ideas. By the time you get the Principia, you've got Newton saying, no, we're going to be able to represent this in terms of evidence that is observed facts about occurrences in the natural world, and then mathematical frameworks that model those things. And that's really a profound shift that then, yes, shows up in other disciplines in science, in medicine in places, evolution in biology. You certainly actually probably the next big place is in a sense, Dalton's atomic theory, where he sits down and he pulls out, stuff from Lavoisier and others. You get this sense that, okay, now it's, you're not going to have the argument about whether, say matter is continuous, as Aristotle would have said, or atoms moving in a void like Democritus says. You're going to look at these results of chemical experiments, starting with Boyle and moving through Lavoisier, and you're going to build an explanatory model or hypothesis framework theoretical piece that is able to account for those things. And that's, I think, where you really see this ascendancy of fact-based authority coming out of, maybe a more medieval authority or tradition-based authority.
Well, let me just share one thing. So I just posted it there in the chat. I once wrote a paper about Auguste Comte, who was an early sociologist, and his vision for the future of humanity was a religion of humanity, where instead of popes and priests, you had scientists and engineers. Right. And he really envisioned scientific knowledge guiding all facts of life and all, order and structure.
That's the Enlightenment ideal, right?
That's the Enlightenment ideal, right? It's kind of the apotheosis of the Enlightenment. And it might be a good time. I think we had a great question from Mark, who talked about what are the drawbacks of these different disciplines or fields of inquiry having their own internal logic, and how can we cross those borders? Because in as much as we might recognize, yes, there is not a perfectly cohering body of knowledge, there has to be some correspondence. Chemistry and biology and psychology do relate. So how can we go across silos? And I mean, gosh, universities don't make that easy.
No, I was going to say that's.
I guess that's why we have podcasts.
Yeah, I was going to say that's been one of my problems. Like I'm not bashing STEM. I don't want to get into that. That's not productive and that's not helpful. And I really think there should be more interaction between all of these fields. I think every English major should take some physics classes, honestly. But that's one of the problems I always have when I've got I'll teach like a class of computer engineers. And part of what I think a lot of the educational model does is channels, partially because it has to, channels all inquiry into one specific route, right? And that becomes your model for viewing the entire world. And the entire world does not work like a computer, or it doesn't work like an engine. Yes, and philosophy courses, yes, absolutely. I'm very strongly in favor of like this interdisciplinarity, but I think, Zach, you're right. The university does not make it easy. You know?
And the thing I think I would say, one, to respond to Susan's comment about philosophy courses, if I got to run the world in terms of the university curriculum, every student would take a course in philosophy, just
right.
as a matter of course, just because I think it's so valuable. And especially physics majors, it's an important thing we need to do. I think Feynman was wrong when he said, shut up and calculate. But one of the things, and again, I'm gonna pull from my past as a kid. I was a fantasy reader. Read a lot of fantasy novels when I was a high school student, and I think there was one. I think the title was Master of the Five Magics or something like that, and it sort of describes this world where there were 5 different fields of magic, and you have this sort of hapless individual who sort of careens, learning bits and pieces from each field until all of a sudden he recognizes the sense that there are underlying themes, and that those themes inform the specific practices in those fields of magic, and thus is able to beat the bad guy at the end of the book, and good triumphs over evil, et cetera, et cetera. And that's one of the things, I tell my students, and I teach a history and philosophy of science course every once in a while. And one of the things that I talk about when we talk about the idea of what makes science science, and why is science unique and yet also part of the liberal tradition in the West, is I talk about this idea of inquiry, and that, there are different forms of inquiry, and those forms of inquiry have to be different because of some of the restrictions or constraints, you might say. Like, in science, I'm only allowed to consider the natural world, but it's the only thing that I can test in a way that's falsifiable, right? And those are criteria that constrain what science as a method of inquiry is, right? But that doesn't mean it's the only method of inquiry, which I think, you'll hear, and again, scientism, really causes problems with this. Some people say it's the only method of inquiry, it's the only valid method of inquiry, or even a less strong position, that which is, I think you see a lot more often in some circles, which is science is the best method of inquiry. I don't think either of those things are true. Science is a method of inquiry, and it helps us understand the human experience, just like all of the other methods or forms of inquiry, and that the person who wishes to really understand the world around them has to engage in multiple methods of inquiry deeply and fully to have a true understanding. And that's your computer science majors, they all want to just figure out how the machine works and how to get the program to give the output that it's supposed to give, where it's like, but do you understand why is that a useful thing to do? Why is it that we want to talk about how we program autonomous vehicles so they don't kill the user, or maybe they do kill the user and not the bus full of school children, And that's why you got to have that philosophy course to have that thought, I guess.
Well, my old advisor used to have this joke about T.S. Eliot. Eliot, in the early 20th century, he had this complaint. He said that a dissociation of sensibility had set in, and he viewed the 20th century as particularly tragically fragmented, and that there's no whole knowledge and everything. And if you read The Wasteland, that's the impetus, or I guess the animus, is that there's no, he's lamenting a perceived coherency that probably never existed. But my old advisor used to say, what did Eliot want? A hockey playing nun who teaches calculus and writes poems in her spare time. But I think you're right that part of this, I think both of y'all are sort of like working into this issue, and possible ways to navigate it is through education in some capacity, some kind of mixing of fields, interdisciplinarity, how to get there either officially or unofficially, is sort of the issue, right?
I think that's right. And I think one question that a lot of people who engage surfacely with postmodernism say, well, if there's no objective truth, then hell, nothing's true. There's no way to act in the world. And I'd like to share, I guess, how I think about this, which is basically pragmatism. And pragmatism, it's not just you do what works, although I think that's part of it. It's that you recognize that all we have is a community of inquirers, a community of people who are trying to develop a body of knowledge. And
Zach,
they may be, yeah.
Can I interrupt you for 1 minute?
Sure.
Are you speaking about pragmatism? I just want to clarify something. Are you speaking about pragmatism pragmatically, or are you speaking about it in terms of the sort of movement of thinkers in America in the early part of the 20th century?
Yeah, I'm thinking of William James and Dewey,
okay. Dewey
and Peirce, and basically, what do we do with if someone says I don't believe climate change, and someone else says, well, there's 97% of scientists who do, and they say, well, we can't know anything, so I'm still gonna drive my Hummer. I think what you can say is, look, although we can't have perfect, objective, eternal truth because we are subjective beings, we can be fairly confident about the knowledge that we do have, and act on that knowledge as it currently stands, but then always be open that it could be improved, changed, altered in light of new things. And that's basically science too. But I think it crosses the bridge into political action, which is, yes, all we have is pragmatic, partial truth, but it's still actionable. We still have a pretty good idea of what COVID does. We have a pretty good idea of what, how climate change works. So we can still make political choices together. And we do need to trust scientists when they provide facts that we can act on.
I'd like to respond to something that I think Avon wrote in the chat, if I could.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I mean, Avon, I think you make a point here about sort of what science does as a creative activity that I think is just absolutely valid. I mean, there's this misconception about science that, it's this almost robotic process, often devoid of the same types of creativity one might see in other forms of inquiry. And yet, one of the things that I sort of try to teach my students is, in fact, that science is a profoundly creative activity, if in no other place. But this would certainly, I don't think this, I think it's much broader than this, but in the act of hypothesis formation. Right. To follow on, whether it's Kant or William Ewell or some folks after that, the idea that, that we just sort of, the hypotheses just present themselves in some logical, rational manner. That's not how science is done. And I think everybody pretty much recognizes that there is a profoundly creative aspect to that. But in science, and I think probably this is true in every form of inquiry, there are constraints to that act of creativity, right? There are boundaries outside of which you say, okay, maybe this is no longer science. That doesn't mean it's invalid. And, and what the argument you always hear in physics is string theory science. And, if you take a pretty strong position on the idea of some of these boundary conditions upon which science must rest, you kind of have to put string theory more in the field of metaphysics right now, because it doesn't produce testable predictions. It's this beautiful mathematical structure, but beauty isn't necessarily scientific truth. As I think a recent book written, talks a little bit about how physics oftentimes gets led down the wrong path by trying to follow beauty rather than empirical evidence. And, I think that sense of, that creativity oftentimes arises out of a community, a community of investigators, a community of thinkers, people getting together at conferences over lunch, writing stuff on napkins, all those stories that you hear, which are really actually very much true. And then, somebody makes some comment in a session that you're sitting in at a conference. And I mean, that sparks something off in your imagination, and you go back and you work on it. And, you're a German guy in Switzerland walking past the train stations while trying to think about if you're going to approve a patent on, synchronizing clocks that you're working on. And next thing you know, you've got special relativity, right? To use a real world example there.
Yeah, and I think there is and can be a lot of overlap between all of these things. The extraordinarily bleak American novelist Cormac McCarthy has a position at a New Mexico think tank. And it's this position where the think tank tries to draw together artists and writers and scientists and physicists. And what everybody always says is that this sort of going along with what you're talking about in terms of the blending and the aestheticization of science and this kind of approach that it's sort of dry or what have you. Everybody always says that when McCarthy gets up to the board and starts writing out theorems, they're some of the most eloquent things you've ever seen. There's like an elegance to the way that he does his mathematics. To say that these things are without their beauty is to miss the point. And I wish my co-host Daniel was here. Daniel's brother is an astrophysicist, and Daniel has talked about how his brother in the act of discovery gets extraordinarily emotional. Like these things aren't affective at the same time. So to try to you don't necessarily want the most passionate calculus teacher you've ever met, but you do, well, unless they're passionate about calculus, but you do need to recognize that it's, I think, as you said, Zach, a human endeavor. Or I'm sorry, Chad, I think you were saying that it's a human endeavor.
Absolutely. So are there other, I guess, questions maybe?
We do have a question from Mitch Hampton, who he said, basically a very good question about definitions. He says, some people who appear to be opposed to what they call Western philosophy in general conflate empiricism and rationalism, possibly out of ignorance of the opposition of these two. How do you see the possibility of clarity over definitions in terms of having debates like these? How do you teach your students empiricism and rationalism, Chad? And maybe more broadly, like, what is a big misconception about, the science or inquiry that is partly just needs to be taught kind of through humanistic teaching?
I think probably what comes to mind, and this is something I probably would want to spend like days thinking about, but the first thing I think that comes to mind when I'm teaching my students is when we're talking about logic systems and the difference between inductive logic and then things like abductive, or I should say deductive logic, and then things like inductive or abductive logic. And I think a lot of my students, the big misconception they have is they think that, okay, science proves things and their idea of proof is deductive proof. Mm-hmm. And then they are, when they are confronted with a historical example where the supposed deductive proof of a scientific idea is then shown to be incorrect by, a more accurate set or a more incisive set of empirical data, then they begin to question, oh my goodness, does science actually prove anything, and is science valid, and all of that? And being able to have the conversation with my students about the fact that science is an inductive process where it is not deductive. It's not if A equals B and B equals C, therefore, A equals C, that there are, you're building models in physics. This is one of the definitions of what physicists do. You're building models based off the data that you have, with the understanding that the models you have will explain that data, but as you get new data that maybe gives you deeper insight into the world, well, that may violate, based on induction or abduction, may violate the model that you've built. And so you have to go back and revise and reform your model. And the thing that's really interesting is once I show my students that, it is amazing how much of the tension that I think they feel about science drains away. And I think that kind of comes into the sense of rationality. I think it's associated with deductivism, whereas empiricism is founded on, of course, induction. And so I don't know that I would say they're oppositional, but they're certainly never going to hold inductive reasoning and inductive methodologies to deductive standards, which, of course, that gets to Hume's problem of induction and the work that's been done in the 300 years since then, trying to figure all of that out, right? And it's led to some really incredibly insightful philosophy of science.
Well,
that's right. No, Thomas Kuhn wrote this book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, 1962. And that book's really helpful for realizing that, it is not it's not a simple linear accumulation of facts,
right?
Is the way that science works. Rather, it's, these paradigms and stories, basically big stories with very persuasive data, that once there's enough outliers and unexplainable things and new discoveries can be changed. and that shows that, I mean, to me, the point of I think maybe your brother, Claude.
Daniel's brother.
Daniel's brother. That it is an art. Science is also an art. It's also this creative process of, telling a story with data that you accumulate.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you guys so much. This has been definitely enlightening for me. It's also been great to see everybody sort of chatting on the side, kind of engaging, from the side. This has really been fantastic. Thank you both so much for joining me in this, and I hope it was as entertaining and informational to everybody listening as it was for me. Thank you guys both so much.
Thanks everybody for joining us. This was fantastic.
Thank you all. Enjoy. Bye.
Take care.